From NJ.com, this is Talk is Cheap, a New York Giants podcast. We're talking Big Blue football all year round.
Welcome on in, Giants fans, to episode 86 of Talk is Cheap. I'm Joe Giglio, joined as always by James Cratch and Dan Duggan. They cover the Giants for NJ Advanced Media as the first wave of free agency is over. We're into the second wave now, and the Giants were busy. Really, as soon as we wrapped up last week's podcast with our plans for what the Giants should do, they went out there and landed Brandon Marshall, one of the biggest names on the open market, and really the first domino, I think, to kind of fall throughout all of NFL free agency. They bring in Rhett Ellison. They bring in DJ Fluker. So the Giants have made some moves here to improve their offense. We'll also talk about what's next. James, we'll start with you. Let's start with the big name and the guy that everyone was talking about last week, and now we can kind of digest it and kind of figure out how he's going to fit in with the New York Giants. Brandon Marshall on a 2-year, $12 million deal. What was your first thought when it happened?
My first thought was I really couldn't believe it actually happened. I mean, we talked about it. I think I went back in our archives. I think the first time Dan and I wrote about the possibility several times. I think the first time we mentioned it was in a mailbag, and I forget the person who asked the question on Twitter off the top of my head, but I will find their name. I'm going to tweet it out later on. Thank you for starting that. You know, you started it. I thought it was a great idea for the Giants. Thought it made a ton of sense. it just never seemed like it was it just seemed like it was too good to be true. And so I said on the podcast when we taped it last week, you know, I don't know if it's going to happen. You know, it might not be, but hey, it happened. You know, obviously Brandon Marshall had to take a significant amount less than the market probably was dictating for him now that you've seen the other salaries. But, you know, he's been very clear. You know, it's kind of – I kind of learned what the Jets guys are like. Brandon's everywhere, it seems. You know, every time you watch him on Good Morning Football, and then you realize he's on Mike and Mike and stuff like that. He's a star, and I think that it's a move that makes a lot of on-field sense for the Giants, and I think it also makes some off-field sense. It's going to be really fascinating. You know, the Giants, they had a lot of star power last year, and I feel like they have even more now with Brandon Marshall. So it's not something I ever thought was going to happen. It just kind of seemed too good to be true, but it has happened. I think that, you know, obviously the Giants probably to give a little, Marshall to give a little, but here they are, and I think the Giants made a major move, big move for Jerry Reese bringing in Brandon Marshall.
It was, and now the Giants sit back and you look at that wide receiver depth chart, and I mean it is as packed and as good as any you'll see in the NFL. Odell Beckham, Brandon Marshall, and Sterling Shepard. Dan, I remember last week you were talking up the possibility and the idea of this, and kind of just saying how good it could look if it did come together, and now it's real. I mean, this is really the Giants' depth chart at wide receiver. It's pretty amazing to look at. I mean, we'll see in September if it works out on the field, but on paper, it's pretty dynamic.
Yeah, and I was definitely someone who said on-field would be a great fit, and I thought off-field it wouldn't be for two reasons. Chiefly was financial. I just didn't think a player of Brandon Marshall's caliber who was due to make $7.5 million from the Jets, asks for his release from there, is then going to go and take, you know, I wouldn't say a fraction of that, but definitely a pay cut. So I just didn't think in this market that would happen, especially when you see some of what the other receivers are getting. Pierre Garçon's making $15 million next year. I mean, that's a player who's not as good as Brandon Marshall, making more money in 1 year than Marshall's due to make in 2. So it just didn't seem like it would work from a financial standpoint. So tip your hat to Marshall for kind of being one of these guys who actually follows through on trying to go and win, because he could have just stayed in the Jets and collected a $7.5 million. They even wanted to extend him, I believe. So certainly follow through on wanting to win. And I know a lot of people said, oh, well, he just wants to be on Showtime. We'll see on that, because he basically said he's not going to be a weekly correspondent on that Inside the NFL show. He didn't fully close the door. He was a little evasive of exactly what that means. But the bottom line is he didn't do this deal just so he could be on Showtime. It sounds like, if anything, he's going to do less Showtime. So all that stuff is great. And obviously, kudos to Reese for closing the deal, though it's pretty tough to turn down when a Pro Bowl receiver wants to join your team for short money. I think any GM can close that deal. I still have a little bit of a question. He has said everything you want to hear, these first couple of days, and as James said, he's been everywhere. It still is a lot easier to say, hey, I'm fine with being the number 2 or even the co-number 2 with Sterling Shepard. It's easy to say that on March 13th. Let's see in week 6 when there's those games when Odell has 16 targets, Shepard has 6, and Marshall has 2. Now, maybe he will totally accept that. Maybe he's secure enough. I mean, the guy's career is phenomenal. I mean, Darryl Slater wrote something on our site that he's basically in a position where he can set himself up for the Hall of Fame. And when you really look at the numbers, it's hard to debate that. So maybe he is secure enough, really does just want to win. He definitely does seem to understand that Odell is the number one guy. But I still want to see it, I'll believe it when I see it that a guy with his, track record is going to be totally content with being the number 2, sometimes number 3, maybe the number 4 option some games. Really hasn't been something he's done in his career. And then the personality fitting in the locker room, he seems like, he says the right things, that he'll be good with the media. I know obviously he's rubbed players wrong pretty much every stop he's been at. Has a relationship with Odell. I think that's key. It's not, you're not kind of throwing in 2 unknowns there. They seem to get along, so I think that goes a long way. But on paper, phenomenal signing. Unless it totally blows up, I still think it's a great signing, even if it doesn't work out exactly, as best case scenario. Just because to get a talented player like him for that type of money, you really can't go wrong with that.
Yeah, I agree. He's been, and he really. I read Darryl's piece, and I had thought about this, 2 years ago during his, the last big year Brandon Marshall had. That, I mean, you look at his numbers. I mean, he's on the path to the Hall of Fame, if not, knocking on the door already before he gets to the Giants, before he plays with the best quarterback he's probably ever played with Eli Manning, before he goes to a team that can actually make the playoffs, something he's ever done. The one thing, though, and look, you could say this is the Jets last year, you could say maybe it's a little bit of Marshall. His numbers did drop off precipitously from 2 years ago when he was Brandon Marshall to last year where he was much less than the normal Brandon Marshall. James, we're talking about a receiver here. I think I saw the graphic last week when he signed. He has the most catches in the NFL since 2007. So it's been a decade where Brandon Marshall's been more productive than anyone. What kind of player do we think the Giants are getting here? Is he still the guy he was 2 years ago? Is he what he was last year? Something in between? What do you think Giants fans should expect?
I think, look, when you say the stats dropped off, they're true. I mean, obviously Brandon was banged up last year with the Jets, and I wrote this when they signed him. If you take those stats that Brandon Marshall had when he was playing with Ryan Fitzpatrick and Bryce Petty and Geno Smith, he might be playing with Geno Smith again someday, we'll see. And you take the fact that he was injured, I mean, those numbers were still better than what the Giants got out of Victor Cruz on the outside last year, and they were relatively comparable to what they got out of Ruben Randle in 2015. Obviously, Brandon, I think, is a much better player than Ruben Randle, but the Giants' offense was a lot more efficient, you have to admit, in 2015 with Randle on the outside than it was with Cruz on the outside, which I think this speaks more to the fact that Cruz was kind of square peg, round hole. He's a slot receiver who was trying to play on the outside. I think the Giants are getting a good player in Brandon Marshall. He's just a year removed from a monster season. Eli is the best quarterback he's played with in his career. I just think it's a really good move for the Giants. And even if Brandon Marshall gives them the numbers he gave the Jets in 2016, I do think that is a step up, and that's going to improve the offense just simply because of the type of player Brandon Marshall is, the element he brings to the offense. Real quick, I looked it up. A guy named Dan at DC Brew 10, February 10th, 2017, 8:52 p.m., he tweeted me for a mailbag asking, would the Giants have interest in Marshall as the third wide receiver if the Jets release him? Then we got the mailbag on February. So, yeah, go follow DC Brew 10, Giants fans. He brought Brandon Marshall to East Rutherford. Give him the talk is cheap bump.
But I'll throw one thing in, actually. Marshall was ahead of him because again, as James said, he's been everywhere, and he always provides an incredible anecdote or something interesting. And he said as soon as the season ended, I'm sure most Giants fans have probably heard this by now. I think he said it a few different places, but he sat down and made a list of all the teams. This is back in January, and of course, the moral of the story was that the Giants were number one on that list, and I think he said the Patriots and the Seahawks and the Steelers were maybe on that same tier or a line below. But he was thinking about it back in January, and I know he had another story where he said that he ran into Archie Manning. I don't know, James, maybe you can fill in the blanks. I think it was at the Super Bowl in a bathroom or something like that.
Yeah.
So, the bottom line is Brandon has been thinking about this as soon as the season ended, so it really seems like it was meant to be.
It does. And for the Giants, I mean, it's a match made, in heaven if everything goes well, right? And on paper, it seems great. Before we get to the other moves the Giants made here and how they're trying to augment this offense, Brandon Marshall's the big name. The last thing, James, with this, your thoughts, I want to get both your thoughts on this. Everyone is kind of looked at it from, I think at first, the Marshall angle, right? Like, how will he accept his role? Because this is Odell Beckham's wide receiver room. He's the best wide receiver, all that kind of stuff. And people have wondered, would they butt heads? Could they? Do you give any thought to maybe Marshall helping Odell move along in his career and become, continue to become a great receiver? I mean, Marshall's dealt with a lot, on and off the field. He's dealt with being in the spotlight. He's been the most productive receiver in the NFL for a decade. Do you think it could actually go the other way, James, that maybe he could actually help Odell Beckham?
I definitely think he could help Odell Beckham. I mean, Brandon is a guy who obviously, look, Marshall, early in his career, there's all kinds of stories, all kinds of off-field issues. But it seems that, since he got to New York with the Jets, everything's kind of turned around. I know that there were some issues with the Jets last year in their locker room, but it never really seemed like it was Brandon Marshall who was disrupting. It just seemed like it was just a bad team and a bad environment, because the Jets were such a train wreck. I definitely think Marshall could help. I mean, he's a guy who has made it very clear that he understands where Odell is. You're young, the big start, you have the issues, you got to mature. I just think the key for them is going to be, obviously Brandon Marshall has to. I mean, obviously everyone kind of has to strike a fine line with Odell. I think this is a major year in Odell's career. They had the first 3 years. Jerry Reese kind of drew the line in the sand at the end of the season. Fans keep on talking about, they got to extend Odell. They got to do this. They got to do that. Well, I mean, obviously Odell Beckham is in the Giants' future long term. Obviously, they're going to pick up his fifth-year option. But I don't think you can go and say, we got to get this extension done now, because I just think it would kind of ring hollow that Jerry Reese kind of drew that line in the sand and basically said, enough is enough, time to grow up. And then you would hand him a big deal without him playing a single game and kind of proving that he's gotten the message. So I think it's a crucial year for Beckham in his career. And I think that having Marshall can help. But as Dan said, there's always kind of lingering, until we actually see it happen and everything work out fine, people are going to have doubt. And that's because, of the various, past factors and all this. But look, I don't think the Giants would have brought Brandon Marshall in if they weren't 100% confident that this is going to work.
Dan, how do you think it affects Odell? And we, you mentioned earlier how Marshall might react, but how about Odell? You think he could actually benefit from this, or do you think there could be a negative aspect to having Marshall with him?
I'll start by saying, I think, again, Marshall's saying all the right things. I like the way he put it that, I'm going to be in the room, and those younger guys can kind of just take from me organically. Organically was kind of his word of the day, but he's not going in saying, I'm going to be the big brother, and I'm going to tell him this and that, because I don't know if Odell would receive that very well, because, again, these are two guys with huge egos. But I think the fact that Marshall's going in kind of understanding, listen, I've been through it all, and Odell is smart enough that he can pick on that if he wants to, but I'm not going to go in and be overbearing, because obviously that can be annoying. And, you're a grown man. You don't need someone kind of being your parent. And the good thing I think that speaks to that, which I kind of touched on earlier, is they have a relationship. According to Marshall, he was counseling Odell last year when things were really hitting the fan with, all the kicking net and all that stuff. When things were really at its fever pitch, he and Marshall were in contact back then. So the fact that Odell was proactively reaching out to a guy who's not even on his team, I would think that when they are together, Odell is going to be receptive. And again, as you guys have mentioned, Marshall's been through it all. So he can certainly relate to a lot of what Odell's going through. So I think that's a positive. But at the end of the day, it's on Odell. I mean, there was a talk, Victor Cruz says he would have prevented the Josh Norman thing. Well, then Victor Cruz ends up really doing nothing when everything was going crazy with Odell last year, and then he's on the boat in Miami. And then now Marshall's saying if I was here, the Miami trip wouldn't happen. That's all great. It's a good soundbite. Odell's a grown man. He is, it's all on him, and that's what it comes down to. It's nice you can have good role models, and maybe Marshall can be that. But to expect someone to come in and somehow change who Odell is and what he's been and what he's become, I mean, that's only going to come from Odell. And Brandon Marshall, he can't change how Odell acts, how Odell reacts. So again, maybe he'll be a good role model, because Brandon Marshall can say, listen, I've been there, I've done that, and now look, I've kind of gained some maturity, and so it's just kind of maybe a good thing to follow. But I don't think Brandon Marshall can actively really impact Odell's behavior. It's going to be on Odell to do that.
Yeah, and Marshall, look, he has experience in this. This is the fourth time now he's changed teams, and here's the good news for Giants fans listening to this episode. Every single time so far in Marshall's career, and I understand he's getting older now, so this might not continue, but every single time he changes teams from Denver to Miami, Miami to Chicago, Chicago to the Jets, he's had a big year, his first stop in the new place. 86 for 1,014 first year with Miami, 118 catches, 1,500 yards first year with Chicago, and then 2 years ago, 109 catches, 1,502 yards, and 14 touchdowns first year with the Jets. So Brandon Marshall has experience doing this, fitting in and playing well his first year. So and that's the big one. That's the first move the Giants made. Let's talk about the other two ones, the offensive moves the Giants made here. Rhett Ellison. That one, I think, probably caught some Giants fans by surprise. Not a household name, but he's a guy. You know, look at the contract, 4 years, $18 million. It seems like the Giants believe this guy is going to be a big help to their team. What do you think about the move, and how do you think he's going to be used here?
I think it's a good move. Obviously, the contract details sort of came out Monday, most of them. It looks like it's probably basically one of the things fans have to realize when you hear these contracts and people go, oh, my God, how can they pay that? Usually it's not like they're committing 4 years. I mean, it looks like Ellison's deal is pretty much a 2-year deal that they would be able to kind of move out of. You know, there's a lot of – his salary's pretty big the final 2 years, and who knows if the Giants will end up paying that. But, no, I mean, I think it's a move they had to make. Obviously, they released Will Johnson that they clearly were not comfortable with where he was physically, and maybe they just think Ellison's a better player. He's a guy who can play tight end, play fullback, play H-back. You know, seems like he's – a really good guy off the field. You know, everything. You know, we had a really good conference call with him. They needed that presence. You know, one of the things the Giants, they didn't have a fullback presence last year. They really didn't have a blocking tight end presence. At the end of the season, on Bagley, I was talking with one of the offensive starters who basically told me, you know, losing Will Johnson was a major impact to this team in his opinion, because he said, you know, we didn't lose a player, we lost a position. We didn't have a fullback, and that was something that could have, you know, I think hamstrung to an extent what the Giants could do. Obviously, they didn't have a guy to kind of go give Eric Flowers help or Bobby Hart help on the edges. So I think Ellison's is a good signing. He's a quality player. He was sort of like Will Johnson a year ago when they signed him from the Steelers. He was a guy who was productive in Minnesota, but the Vikings didn't necessarily use him a whole heck of a lot, or as much as they probably could have. I think the Giants will get a lot more use out of Ellison. I know the numbers seem a little high, but compared to what guys around the league got, it's pretty much on par, and I think it's a contract. If the Giants have to wiggle out of it, they can probably do so after 2 years.
Dan, I remember last year us talking a lot about how predictable the Giants' offense was, and it clearly was. I mean, we knew the formation, the plays, it was like the same thing every time. Do you think a guy like Ellison could help them be more versatile just in maybe the way they line up or what they can run just because of the different things he can do? You think that's part of the reason he's here now?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. I think we all probably undersold how big the loss was of Will Johnson last training camp. At the same time, you can easily turn around and say, well, if he was going to be that big a part of your scheme, why didn't you go pick somebody up in the 17 weeks that they could have done so? So I don't know. Obviously McAdoo doesn't give much, and then after the season, Jerry Reese downplayed a fullback in this offense, and then you go out and spend $8 million guaranteed on a guy. It's going to be interesting though. I think the key that Ellison has that Johnson has as well is versatility. He's not going to be a straight I formation fullback. You can put him there. You can kind of flex him out as an H back, put him on the line as a tight end. I think that's the key. But to your point, I think it maybe gives him a little flexibility that you don't have to be in 11 personnel every single snap now, because you can maybe play a tight end on the line, have Ellison as an H back, play just more 2 tight end sets. Although then that's kind of funny because now you have Marshall. You're probably going to want to be in 11 personnel as much as you were last season, because that really is your 3 best weapons, where I thought they were kind of fooling themselves to think that Cruz was this big weapon they couldn't get off the field last year. Marshall probably is going to be that type of a weapon. So I think options are good, and I think that was one of the biggest problems this offense didn't have last year was no flexibility, no versatility. It was, this is what we're going to do every snap. Ellison is a nice guy to be able to mix things up. At the same time, it's funny that, fans are great. You can get excited. No one's ever heard of this guy. Let's be honest. I mean, he was a blocking tight end back in Minnesota. Seems like a pretty good amount of money when you consider, a top end tight end like Martellus Bennett got $21 million for 3 years. So, I guess I'm kind of the Debbie Downer today. Let's see what his impact is. I mean, he didn't play a ton of snaps in Minnesota, so if he's going to have a similar role here, which probably he won't be, they wouldn't be paying him if he's going to play a quarter of the snaps. But let's see how much they're going to use him before getting too excited. Because again, I do think they'll be 11 personnel a lot. So unless he's going to be the every down tight end, seems like it's a little bit of a steep price tag for him, but. I do think he's a useful guy, and it's not my money. So if he can help the offense, I'm sure it'll be looked at as a good addition.
Well, I think the question is, when it comes to McAdoo and the offensive predictability, and what Giants fans, I guess, who are trying to be optimistic would lean on is, was McAdoo's offense so predictable because that's who he is, or was it predictable because he basically felt his personnel tied his hands? I think that's what it's really going to come down to.
Right,
if Will Johnson was there, would they have been, all kinds of – remember, like when they signed Will Johnson – and look, I understand Ben basically doesn't like – if I said, hey, Ben, that looks like your shirt's green, he wouldn't – he'd say, no, it's not or something because he thinks everything's like some state secret that, somehow that the Cowboys are going to beat the Giants in week 2 because Ben tells me that what position Will Johnson is. I just think – maybe if they had Will Johnson, they would have had all this creativity and they would have used him in different ways. I don't know, maybe if not to hammer on Victor Cruz, but maybe if they actually had a more of a prototypical outside wide receiver, they would have done things differently. I don't know. I just think that there's a chance, I'm not guaranteeing it, that this Giants offense will be a little bit more creative in 2017 because McAdoo might have more pieces. For all we know, he just felt his hands were tied with what he had, and that was the best way to go. Obviously, it didn't work, and I still think that at some point they should have said, okay, this is clearly not working. We got to try to figure out to do something. And there were points that they did something, and then they basically just went away from them. But I think that's maybe the hope for Giants fans is that Ellison and Brandon Marshall – and whatever they get in the draft might kind of open things up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it can't be less creative. I mean, they have that going for them. So, yeah, I mean, hey, I think he's a good piece. But, again, I just go back to if he's going to fill this role that Will Johnson was supposed to fill last year, when Will Johnson got hurt in the first week of the preseason, they should have gone out and got somebody then if it was that vital of a piece. I mean, it's not that these guys are growing on trees, but it's also not a guy who, if you lost Odell, that's going to impact the offense in a way you can't really compensate for.
I totally agree. I mean, I think also Will Johnson, we didn't really ever see what they were going to do with Will Johnson as he got hurt in the first preseason game. But, I mean, not to go too deep in the weeds, but they did have a situation where, obviously Whitlock got hurt, although I didn't think Whitlock was going to make the team when he got hurt. He's not really a prototypical fullback and impact player. But, they also had that kind of like bing, bang, boom week where they lost the Malik kid who, and obviously Lacoste as well. Right. So, I don't know. I think if you're a Giants fan who's trying to understand the move, I think maybe you're saying, okay, well, maybe they're going to do things differently because they have the pieces. I agree with Dan, though. I thought one of the biggest roster failings the Giants made was not going out and getting a fullback. I mean, there are fullbacks out there. There are guys, obviously, that you can get someone. So I thought they should have found someone, and that was an oversight by them that I think really hurt them.
Right, and look, and maybe they reconsidered and said this is a really important thing because it really did hamstring us last year. We thought we could get by without replacing Will Johnson, and that's why they go and spend money on Rhett Ellison. So maybe it's they did some self-assessment and realized, listen, we were in 11 personnel too much. We do need that guy. Let's go out and get who they obviously determined was the best guy in the market to fill that role.
Yeah, well, now I think the onus will move towards Ben McAdoo with this, right? Because they give him this guy, and assuming he stays healthy and all these players stay healthy to start the season, they're giving him an extra chess piece here. And if he's playing checkers again, and we're talking about, 11 personnel in the same formation over and over again for the first month of the season, then we'll probably go back to that conversation and what Ben McAdoo is doing. Now, we all know his offense, and Eli Manning in particular, will be better if the offensive line in front of Eli Manning is better, specifically in pass protection. So the third move the Giants made in free agency was bringing in DJ Fluker, a former first-round pick of the Chargers in the 2013 draft. Has not been anything close to great or really good in the NFL, but he's 26 years old. He was a first-round pick. So I think the first takeaway is there's probably some upside there if he can find himself. James, what did you think of the Fluker move as we were all waiting to see, what would the Giants do on the offensive line? And so far, this is our answer.
I thought it was a good move for the Giants. Obviously, it's kind of a low risk, high reward move. I was surprised that they were able to get Fluker at only $3 million. I thought he'd be a little bit higher, given the salaries around the league. The fact that a guy like Luke Joeckel, albeit more of a tackle guy, it seems like Fluker's going to be more of a guard candidate. Got $8 million from the Seahawks, but it's a flyer. If it works out, great. If it doesn't, you move on. The Giants had to do something with the offensive line. They had to create more competition in there, and obviously they weren't going to. Once you decide, I think, that you're not going after Andrew Whitworth, it's just not worth it, and the Giants didn't have the cap space to go play at the top of the market. So you're going to try to make some second-tier signings, some third-tier signings, maybe hit the draft and kind of build this offensive line out. I just think Giants fans have to realize that there's a very good chance that Eric Flowers is going to stay at left tackle. That's not something they want. Personally, that's not the move I would make, but I don't run the Giants, so it looks like they're going to kind of try to reinforce from within and maybe kind of give Flowers a little bit more help, but leave him on the left side.
Takeaways from DJ Fluker, Dan, a name that we didn't really talk about much. We knew the Giants would be sniffing around the offensive line market to try to see if they could find someone that would fit them at the right cost. For now, Fluker seems to be that guy.
Yeah, I mean, he was certainly on that next tier when free agency opened. Those top guys who you said, oh, maybe the Giants would kick the tires on, and then you saw the contracts they got, and you said, all right, well, I understand why the Giants didn't really, get in too deep with some of those guys. They just didn't have the cap space to be players, and I think it's low risk, but potentially low reward. I mean, obviously it could be high reward, but I mean, this is a guy who was a first-round pick 4 years ago, and the Chargers just, brushed their hands and bid him adieu after 4 years. That doesn't happen a heck of a lot. I mean, it maybe could happen with Eric Flowers in 2 years. That kind of tells you probably what Fluker was looked at. At the same time, he does have the size. He does have the pedigree, the old change of scenery thing. He's still young. Maybe it does click. And of course, when you're only giving a guy $3 million for 1 year, even if he's a disaster, it's not really going to hurt your team, obviously, long term, and really not even in the short term. It's pretty much chump change if you're talking about starting an offensive lineman. But the question is, you can't start cap space at left tackle or right guard, or you need players, and they need to upgrade the talent. So I don't know that Fluker does anything significantly. Is he a significant upgrade than John Jerry or Marshall Newhouse, wherever spot he ends up taking? That remains to be seen. So the fact that the market exploded and a lot of mediocre guys got paid, yeah, that's tough and definitely probably wise that the Giants stayed out of that. But if that's just what the market's going to be for offensive linemen, again, you need talent. So unless you're putting it on the draft, and at 23, I don't think there's anyone they're going to get who's going to be a step-in, day-one upgrade, by any stretch. So if you're looking at more or less the same line with again, Fluker taking maybe John Jerry's spot or taking Bobby Hart's spot, I don't think you've significantly upgraded the biggest weakness. So it's a tough year to have holes in the offensive line, and maybe they kicked themselves for not being more aggressive last year when they had more cap space and could have spent for one of these top guys. I don't know. They're in a tough spot. Basically, they need Eric Flowers, the light to go on. He's a young guy going into his third year. And, the pressure's on him, the spotlight's on him. They need it to click for him, because if it does, I mean, then watch out, because then you have a guy who could be your future left tackle. Problem is, there's just been no sign in his first 2 years he's going to be that guy. So you're kind of stuck with piecemealing this line together on the right side right now, kind of hoping that the additions of an Ellison and a Marshall just make the overall offense better, make the blocking better as far as Ellison, can help these guys. At the end of the day, your right tackle has to line up against Von Miller and block him. It's you can help him as much as you want, but that's the task that these guys have. So it's going to be interesting to see how this line comes together. I think Fluker was probably the best they could do with what they had to spend, what they're willing to spend. But tough to get too excited about a guy who, like I said, was a first-round pick, and his team, said farewell after 4 years.
They did, and he's gone now, and he's a New York Giant, and we'll see if he revives himself here. All right, guys, what do you think's next? Quick thought from each of you on what might be next for the Giants in free agency. We know Jonathan Hankins is still out there, and the defensive tackle market is really outside of Brandon Williams, who got himself a deal reminiscent of Snacks Harrison last year. There's been a lot of one-year deals and good players that might take one-year deals. What do we think happens with Hankins? Any chance he comes back? James, what do you think's next for the Giants here?
That's a great question. I think it depends. There's so many kind of moving parts. I mean, obviously, fans keep on asking, why is JT Thomas still on the roster? Why is Dwayne Harris still on the roster? Shane Vereen obviously has got a roster bonus coming up. I mean, I think it really depends. It's tough to say because, what's the Giants' approach? Are they still looking to add, They have a little bit of cap space left. It seems like they have the least amount of cap space left in the league. When you kind of take what it is now with the Ellison deal factoring in, kind of tack on the Fluker deal, they obviously have ability to make room. But I think it depends on. I do think that obviously Keenan Robinson's a guy I'm sure they like to bring back. Maybe John Jerry. I do think there's a guy like Cody Sensabaugh that he'd be a really solid fourth corner. But then again, the Giants also may kind of feel like, all right, this is we want to do. We're good. Let's just kind of look down the road and try to work on the JPP thing. With Hankins, to me, I think we've all been kind of surprised that not only Hankins, but Dontari Poe, Benny Logan, those guys, I think everyone thought were going to get paid a lot of money really quickly once free agency started. It just hasn't happened. I would guess, the longer Hankins goes unsigned, I would assume that the Giants' chances of bringing him back are better. But at the same time, do the Giants really want to just bring Hankins back on a one-year deal and give him a chance to basically just leave next year? I don't know if that's something that's really in the Giants' best interest. I think you're kind of seeing, in my opinion, that maybe defensive tackle is going to become like a position like running back in the NFL, where if you have a guy who's dominant on your own roster, or a guy like Snacks or Aaron Donald or Ndamukong Suh or Brandon Williams that kind of have a maybe best in the league quality to them, yeah, you're going to go pay that guy. But other than that, I mean, maybe you're just going to draft and develop it and kind of repeat the cycle every 4 years. So I wonder if it's going to sort of become a devalued position. And honestly, I never really felt like Hankins was kind of getting talked up like he was a superstar going into free agency. I think he's a good player, but I don't think he's a guy that I'm rushing out to give $9 million a year to and $25 million in guarantees. So look, if the Giants can get Hankins on a cheap deal, I mean, I guess they could do that. But if I'm the Giants, having kind of been aggressive to try to re-sign him before free agency and him not taking it, I don't want to bring him back unless I'm going to lock him down for a couple of years. He's only 24 years old. He'd make sense to the Giants in their kind of youth movement push, but I would not want to give Hankins a one-year deal. If I'm going to bring him back, I think it has to be a multi-year deal, and it's got to be at their price given the way the market's worked.
Dan, how about for you? What do you think's next, and what are you keeping your eye on as far as the Giants and the rest of the kind of the second tier of free agency?
Second tier is definitely the key way to phrase it, because I think you're at the point now where they've kind of spent what they had, and I think Keenan Robinson's the big guy who's kind of hanging out there. I mean, we talk about not a lot of talk about Hankins, even less about Robinson. Not that that's unusual because he's a second-tier type guy, and the big guys set the market, and those are obviously the top priorities. But I would think they'd want to kind of get to work on him this week. JPP's looming. I kind of have a feeling that this is going to drag out now, because if you didn't get it done by sort of that unofficial start of free agency deadline, what's the impetus now? Unless they really get desperate to open some cap space, there's really no reason for either side to budge at this point. I'm not saying it's going to go all the way to July 15th, which is the deadline to make a long-term deal, but there's nothing really to suggest that that's going to come together, super quickly here. But Hankins is an interesting point. The longer he stays out here, the better I think it does bode for the Giants, because I kind of disagree with James in the sense that I think if Hankins signs a one-year deal, it's going to be a cheap one-year deal. I mean, if someone wants to give him $10 million for 1 year, I don't see what the upside of that would be for another team, because he's 24. So if you like him enough to give him, a big contract for 1 year, why not try and sign him longer term? Obviously, the Giants can't do that because of their cap situation. So maybe it's a no place like home situation where he says, listen, I will come back, kind of bite the bullet, take a short money deal for 1 year. I'll be 25 next year, and when I have a better year this year, and maybe the market rebounds for defensive tackles, because like James said, it's really surprising how soft that market's been for these top defensive tackles, and probably a little concerning. I think that's a big reason why things have been so quiet on the Hankins front, because when your camp goes into free agency expecting a certain number and you're not getting that from anybody, that makes you want to be a little quieter. You might not want to be spreading the word to the media like, oh, yeah, he's coming in about 50% of what we thought he'd get. I mean, that's just human nature. So, but I do think the longer he hangs out there, the more likely he comes back. At the same time, the Giants are just so cash-strapped right now that someone you would think would be able to offer him a little bit more. So then it becomes, what does he value? Just come back to the Giants on a one-year deal, or does he cash in? That's all questions we don't have the answer to. But yeah, to answer the overall question, I think it's just those second tier. You're filling holes at this point, like a Keenan Robinson would fill a hole. Backup quarterback, need to probably add another offensive lineman, kicker, and we're kind of going down the list. These are all positions you need to fill at some point, and I think this is the week where those types of decisions get made.
Well, what's short money for? I think that's a big question. Is that you've got Poe, you've got Hankins, you've got Benny Logan kind of all out there, and it seems like it's kind of this, who blinks first big dance. I think my guess is that once one of those guys does something, the other two will kind of follow. But I think that's a big question. Like, what's short money for Hankins? I mean, if Poe goes, I think Poe was visiting Indianapolis, and there were some reports that they might be interested in giving him a multi-year deal. Well, if he gets a multi-year deal, and that might set a market where a guy like Hankins and Logan, if they want to do their 1-year prove-it deal, but they're still going to be able to get, I don't know. What do you think a good guess, like 6, 7, 8 million? I mean, something like that. I mean, I don't know if the Giants can go that high with Hankins. So that's the thing.
That's the question.
I think those three guys, one of those dominoes has to fall, and my guess is the other two would then follow quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting because younger guys have been a little more inclined to take the prove-it deals. Like you want to talk wide receivers. Obviously, Alshon Jeffrey signed a big prove-it deal, but it's still a 1-year deal when everyone's expecting him to sign a long-term deal. And Terrell Pryor took, I would think most people would call that short money for a guy who had kind of the buzz he had going.
That was a bad deal.
Yeah, it was. But I think that's the only thing the Giants have is that maybe if Hankins is going to take a short-term deal, maybe you leave a little money on the table to stay where you're familiar. You can succeed here. Just everything, the comfort here. And so maybe you take $3 million from the Giants instead of $5 million from the Raiders or Team X. I don't know. I mean, listen, I don't manage his bank account. I don't know what's important to him. The fact that he is so young, I'm thinking that's the only chance the Giants have. Because if someone wants to give him $8 million for 1 year and approve a deal, well, then I think there's no chance they can compete with that. But it is interesting that he's lasted this long when there was talk. I mean, I talked to people at the Combine, and they thought his market was really going to explode, and it clearly hasn't. So I don't know. It's going to be some kind of gut checks going on in his camp. What is important to him? Does he just try and get the most guaranteed money on a longer-term deal or does he bet on himself like a lot of guys seem to be doing and saying, hey, next year I can really cash in? So that'll be very interesting to monitor. Maybe there'll be a little bit more talk on that front this week.
It will be, and we'll be monitoring all. A last one for you guys. We'll look at the NFL free agency as a whole. Quick one from each of you. Just give me either a trend, a story, or a specific move that caught your eye that you found maybe the most interesting or head-scratching, whatever it is, like a big takeaway from free agency. I'll start with the Browns move. I mean, the Browns and the Osweiler deal. I just thought it was fascinating from every perspective. The Texans obviously trying to clear out some space, maybe bring in Romo. We'll see if that happens maybe as people listen to this podcast. And then the Browns basically just using that cap space to bring in a pick. And I just keep looking at what they're doing. If the Browns have any idea how to draft, in 3 years, that team's going to be set up to be good for a long time. It's almost like an NBA move. So I found that really fascinating. James, what stood out to you at the beginning of free agency?
I think I wonder if, and this is just pure speculation, if the Patriots have some sort of idea of how much longer Tom Brady wants to play or something, because it seems to me like they're going for 19-0. They're going like all in now. And it just seems very unpatriot-like. I mean, they gave Stephon Gilmore a tremendous amount of money. They make the deal for Cooks. They still apparently might try to trade Butler. It just seems to me like they make the Dwayne Allen trade. It just seems to me like the Patriots are gunning for something, and I just wonder if they know something that the rest of the league doesn't. The Browns thing obviously jumps out to me. I think the Eagles are going to be kind of much improved. I think the 1-year deal, but for me, I just think that you're kind of seeing what positions are going to be valued and not valued kind of going forward in the league. And it seems to me that it's a market inefficiency, maybe paying offensive linemen who, because of the various, people we've heard all the time with Flowers, and young guys, the CBA is restrictive on developing offensive linemen. Well, maybe it's going to become kind of a market inefficiency to overpay for a proven lineman rather than develop your own. But to me, I think the defensive tackle thing has kind of been a big takeaway to me. It seems like that might be a position that is going to sort of become like the defensive version of running back, where you're just going to churn through draft picks. You're not going to spend a lot of money. You look at the running backs. I mean, all these big names are out there, and Giants fans talk about, does it really make sense for a team to go sign Eddie Lacy for $4 or $5 million a year when they can just go draft a guy in the 5th round that probably give him 80% at least of what Lacy would give him? I don't know. So I think maybe defensive tackle is going to become the running back version on defense.
Dan, what stood out to you?
Yeah, I'll just keep it to one of offensive line. It tells you how important it is to draft these guys. And like James said, it's tough to develop them. But once they hit the open market, it just explodes because it's so difficult to find them. And when you do find them, you don't let good ones get on the market. So you need to, when you draft them early, you kind of need to draft them early because you got to get the studs in there. You know, you're not going to turn a bunch of fifth rounders into Pro Bowlers. You have to use your draft picks on them pretty often, I feel like, and you better be right because otherwise you end up in a DJ Fluker situation where you wasted, I think it was 11th overall pick, and 4 years later you're back at square one where he certainly wasn't what they were hoping for when they drafted him at the Chargers. So I think that's the biggest thing. Because you see, again, all these mediocre, late 20 offensive linemen or even early 30s getting paid. And that's scary because that's not how you want to build your team around aging offensive linemen who haven't been that great, on their first contract. So drafting offensive linemen, always a premium, even more so now because then at least you control their rights for 4 or 5 years, franchise tags, everything like that. And then you'd obviously rather lock up a guy who who's been in your system, is more of a known commodity. So to me, just the offensive line market exploding the way it has definitely stresses the importance of identifying and drafting the right players at that position.
There's a lot going on. It's been a wild first, we're doing this on the 5th day of free agency, a lot more to come. We'll keep everyone, obviously, you guys at NJ.com and us with the podcast up to date with the Giants. We'll be back soon. We're going to start getting more into draft stuff, but whatever the Giants do with a second wave of free agency, we will touch on that in the next episode. James, as always, thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Joe.
And thank you, Dan.
Yeah, Joe, this is my first time going through a free agency. So when do you sleep? Just trying to figure that out.
Have you guys got any sleep yet?
Hey, all I got to say is 9:50 p.m. on Friday night, South Carolina, first NCAA tournament game, and God knows when.
All right, so I'll be on the clock Friday night, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, you're on call Friday night.
Each deal will be agreed upon, and I'll be right now while Cratch is doing God knows what, watching the Gamecocks.
Yeah, the Giants will probably do like 19 different things at 10:30 on Friday night as I'm sitting there waiting for South Carolina. 1973, guys. The last time South Carolina won an NCAA tournament game.
As James purposely ignores emails and phone calls on Friday night. Guys, enjoy the tournament. Enjoy maybe a little downtime as the Giants get a little quieter here with all the big moves, probably for now at least, in the books. But you'll be on it, and we'll be talking about it. And everyone, thanks for listening to episode 86 of Talk is Cheap right here on NJ.com.